Hello there, guys, and welcome to your episode of Linux Stories. And in this Linux Stories podcast episode, we have Daniel Barrett, and he's the author of one of the three books that I have used as my pillar contents, which is the Linux Pocket Guide. And so I wanted to ask Daniel to introduce himself.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me on your podcast. Uh, I am the author of Linux Pocket Guide from O'Reilly, which has been around since I think around 2004 and through multiple editions. I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I work in the technology industry and I've been doing this for quite a while. It's very nice to meet you and happy to be on the show.
Thank you. Thank you too. So I now wanted to ask you about your career so far. So you said that you've been in the tech industry for a long time. What have you exactly worked on? If you can just kind of give an outline of your career.
Sure. Okay. Well, if I go all the way back to college, which was back in the Stone Age, I studied mathematics, and while I was studying that, I also got involved in programming. At the time, the popular language was Fortran, so we're talking quite a while ago. In college, and then from there, started working a little bit in industry. I worked for a company called Air Products and Chemicals in Pennsylvania, where my very first programming project was to build a cost estimator for chemical liquids to see if it was cheaper to truck chemicals to your site or to build a chemical processing plant on your site to eliminate transportation costs. That was really interesting. So as I got more into it, I went to graduate school and got a master's and eventually a PhD. Along the way, I started teaching at the university level, and I taught at Johns Hopkins University for a few years, mostly introductory computer programming. But probably the most significant thing that happened there with regard to Linux is I was, as a graduate student, kind of elected to be this department's computing systems, Sun workstations and Digital Equipment Corporation machines, which you don't see so much anymore. And so with help from friends around us, I learned the Linux command line and system administration. I was there like the day that internet addressing changed to its current hierarchical dot naming scheme, whereas before it was a lot more random. And that was probably the most confusing and complicated day of my career. Suddenly, the entire, ARPANET, as it was called then, just broke because nobody was ready for it. So from there, after I got my doctorate at University of Massachusetts in computer science, where I studied software engineering, I went into industry. For a while, I worked in the financial industry, called D.E. Shaw, which is not your typical, wear a suit every day. You can see I'm clearly not a wear a suit kind of guy. It was really laid back. It was one of the first companies where there were no set working hours, no set vacation days, no set sick days. You just came and left on the honor system. If you worked past 7 in the evening, they would buy you a free meal. And this was back in the 1990s where nobody was doing this. And so that was pretty cool. And there I built financial software and also was kind of the middleman between system administrators, software engineers, and financial brokers. So it was a very interesting position. And then the dot-com crash came, and our company was bought by a big financial company, Merrill Lynch, which was terrible to work for. It was exactly the kind of company where everybody wore suits. We lasted about, I guess I stayed there about a year and a half, 2 years. At a startup called Vistaprint, which is not a startup anymore. They're a big multinational company now. But when I joined Vistaprint, they were 50 people in a basement. So I learned to do absolutely everything that you do in a company. I stayed there for 15 years. And eventually I moved to Google, where I am today.
Oh, and so just kind of a side note before I ask you the next question. While you were talking, there were some parts where the audio just got choppy a little bit, but I think that
Okay.
the people can still resemble what you were saying. So just kind of
Okay.
wanted to throw it out here. So basically, you said you. I have two questions on this. This is really interesting. So the first thing you said that you worked at the startup for 15 years. And now it's not no longer a startup, but at the time you were working there, it was a startup. So can you tell me how is it like to work at a startup? Because and before you begin your answer, because I am just about to graduate with a master's degree, and I'm always really fascinated by tech startups, and I find them
Mhm.
really like these places where you really have to work minimum 70 hours a week, like really push it hard to
Mhm.
survive for a couple of years. So I was wondering what's your experience with startups?
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. I should probably clarify that my 15 years at the company, it was not in startup mode the whole time. I was unclear in what I said. I, it was a it was a startup for about the first 3 or 4 years. Then we went public, and so after that, we were a public company. And not only is it interesting to work at a startup with those wonderful 70 hours a week working hours, as a company grows from to tens of thousands too. So that's kind of interesting as well. At the time we were a startup, we had about 20, 25 software developers, and I was writing software and working as a project manager there. But you had to do everything. Um, we had a lot of rotating roles, like who would be the release manager who would come in at 2 in the morning once every 3 weeks and release the latest software. So I had a sleeping bag in the office, and I would curl up in a conference room and sleep from about 6 at night to about 2 in the morning because I didn't want to drive in very sleepy in the middle of the night and do our releases because it was a website, vistaprint.com, and most of our customers at the time were in the U.S., so we wanted to do our releases while people in the U.S. were asleep. Eventually, as the company became successful, we had customers all over the world. There was no downtime, and so we had to improve our release process so we could do it at any time of day and it wouldn't disrupt the site. Um, but when you're at a startup, there's all kinds of things that are just not true. I mean, if you need help with what you're working on, there might be nobody at the company that knows what you need to know, and you have to figure it out yourself. Um, it may be the case that you need some extra computing equipment and there's just no budget for it, so you just have to make do with what you have. So people get really creative about you know um, saving memory and disk and so forth as they're working, making your algorithms more clever because you just have to. If your production site is running out of memory, that's all the memory you have, so you can't just buy more. um, and so yeah, we were in startup mode for about 3 or 4 years while I was there. Really, we were doubling every 12 to 18 months in size. So when I got there, we were 50. Shortly after, we were 100. By the time we went public, we probably had 1,000 people. That was, 3 or 4 years after I started. So that's exciting. And it's also challenging because how do you train people when you hire them? You're moving at a million miles an hour as a startup. You don't have time to document everything you know. And so when you onboard new people, you basically sit them in a room for a week with existing employees and just talk to learn stuff. And so actually my major project at Vistaprint wound up being how do you onboard new employees quickly? And out of that, I built an onboarding process with a lot of documentation and training. And I wound up creating and running the company's basically educational department, which we call learning and knowledge management. Did from writing software full time to managing the information of the company and the intern program and hiring program and creating training, and I was hiring technical writers and instructional designers and people like that instead of software engineers. So that was very interesting, and that took me eventually to Google, where I am now in Google's educational division, doing similar things but at a 10 times larger scale.
Great, great. That sounds great. And so I wanted to ask you one other thing about your career, which you didn't mention, but I found out about by Googling around. It says on your O'Reilly website that you sang in a heavy metal band, and I also listened to one of the songs, but not from that heavy metal band, but from another song unrelated to it. It's called Longest Path Song. Find the longest path, I believe. And so I just wanted to know what's the backstory behind all of that.
Sure. Well, I've been a musician longer than I've been a computer scientist. And so when I was in high school, my friends and I had a heavy metal band. We called ourselves Electric Funeral. Don't Google us, you'll never find anything. We were not successful, but we were very loud, and that was important. I have a classical piano background, and I wound up in this band just because my friends were played appropriate instruments, and they needed a keyboard player and singer. So there I was. But I've been doing music pretty much for my whole life. The Find the Longest Path song has a background. When I was in graduate school, I was taking a take-home final exam in an algorithm class. And it was a really, really hard exam. So in the middle of this week-long take-home, I got frustrated and I wrote a song about the difficulties of graduate school and the difficulties of finding algorithms for difficult problems. And I recorded it that week while the exam was going on, using my voice and overlaying it. And at the end of the semester, I showed it to my professor. And one of the professors I showed it to took it to a conference and played it at the conference. And that was, in the 1980s. And at that point, I just kind of forgot about the song. And then decades later, people started discovering the song and doing things with it. They were setting it to video on YouTube. There were probably 3 or 4 different implementations of it out there. It was sung live at a conference by a chorus. I don't remember, who ends every semester in his Coursera course with this song. And so it's very flattering and fun that the song has retained some kind of life. It was never my intention. And so, that one is out there. It's still making the rounds.
Yeah, that sounds like a fun story. So basically, I think you actually kind of gave us the context of how did your career go, how did you get started with Linux. And I wanted to ask you, how did your understanding of the Linux operating system evolve over the years? So how did it go from you just kind of understood what Linux is, or you just kind of got exposed to it, and then later on gradually build up on that and build up on that to the point where you could actually write a book, which is very, very high quality on the Linux operating system that is on the command line?
Sure. Well, I started it in a way that a lot of other people started with Linux. And at that time it was Unix, but it was basically a very similar interface. I used it because that was the system provided by the computer science department that I was in for doing our daily work. And a couple of people showed me a couple of commands. I learned how to copy files and move files and so forth. But I didn't use it in any particularly sophisticated way. Just to get work done. I learned a text editor, and you learn kind of just enough to be able to do stuff. And then when I became the system administrator for the computer science department where I was, kind of had to learn a lot fast because people had questions all the time. How do I do this? How do I do that? Can you write me a script? So reading more books, talking to me. And little by little, I started realizing that when you learn Linux in these little pieces like this, you develop superstitions. Things work when you type them, but you don't understand why. You think you understand, but you really don't. The classic example is wildcards. And there are lots of people out there using Linux today that think that a command like ls processes the wildcard when you type it, but it doesn't. It's the shell processes the wildcard and expands it before ls even runs. And if you don't know this, all sorts of things are mysterious. Like, why do asterisks work sometimes but not other times? Why can you use an asterisk or a star in the grep regular expression and it doesn't expand into file names? I mean, there's all kinds of weird things that are mysterious until you really understand what the shell is doing versus what the Linux operating system is doing versus what the command is doing. And in the beginning of Linux Pocket Guide, I really try to make clear that these three parts, the understanding of who's got what responsibility, is so important as you advance. Yeah, so I would say kind of stage one of my Linux enlightenment was understanding what the shell does versus what the command does. Stage two was memorization. Just every command that you learn adds a new tool to your toolbox. And so you can go a long time without knowing, say, the cut command. But the minute you learn the cut command, which cuts columns out of a standard input, where your input is, so it's great for CSV file processing, things like that. As soon as you know the cut command, whole new opportunities open up. And in some ways, I think of using the Linux command line kind of like dancing. If you know a couple of moves, you can repeat them over and over. You can use them in different orders. But each new move that you learn increases your possibilities in your repertoire. So when you're typing commands that have pipelines, and for me, I'd probably use a pipe in every second or third command. It's just second nature. The more you know, the more you can do. That's so different from an operating system like Windows, where everything is point and click, if you're not using PowerShell or one of their command line technologies. But everything is about, it's inventive. Every time you run a command, you have to invent a line that's going to do what you want. And sometimes the invention is simple, like ls, not very complicated. Other times, you have, say, 1,000 files in a directory, and they're all not named .jpeg, and you want to change them all to be .png. That can be done in one command. It's a complicated command, but if you have the tools in mind and you can manipulate them in your mind and just type them, you can move really quickly and be very efficient. So that was kind of stage two. Stage three was learning particular commands that are just incredibly useful. I would say one of those commands is xargs. It's xargs. There are lots of Linux users who have never even heard of this command. All I can say is it completely changes the way you use the command line. What xarg does is you feed it a set of lines of text, and xargs can manipulate those lines and execute them as commands. So for example, if you wanted to find every file in your home directory that ended with a certain suffix, let's say .jpeg, and you wanted to, actually JPEG's a bad example, let's say text file. Find all the text files and you want to, let's say, substitute one string for another. You might use a find command, which will locate all of those files, and then pipe it into xargs, which will build command lines out of those lines and execute them. I don't know if it'll come across in talking, but everybody out there, if you've never used the xargs command, you should check it out. Another one is in the shell, there's actually, let me back up. Another one is actually the command bash. So bash is not the shell that's your default when you log in. It's actually command /bin/bash. And if you can write Linux commands that generate strings that are Linux commands, you can pipe them into /bin/bash and have it run them. And that is opens up all kinds of other possibilities, some of which I talk about at the end of my book, Linux Pocket Guide. And then third, there's everybody who's used Linux for a while knows the $. That's just for variables. And some people know $parenthesis, which is whatever is inside the parentheses is treated like a command and run, and the results are inserted back into the command line. It's the same thing as backticks or backquotes. But the one that a lot of people don't know is less than parenthesis. And everything inside the parentheses is treated as a command again, but the results are treated as if they were in a file. Now, from that abstract description, it's kind of hard to know what I'm talking about, but think about it this way. There are some commands in Linux that do not read from standard input, like copy, for example, and move. They only manipulate files. Paste is another command that usually manipulates files. So if you ever find yourself running a bunch of commands, redirecting your output to files, and then using some of these commands like move and copy and paste that can't read from standard input, follow-up command with the less than parenthesis syntax. And there are some examples of that in the book that do some pretty wild things that you may not have known could have been done on a command line. So yeah, xargs, piping into bash, and the process control operator, that is the less than paren. Those are three life-changing Linux tools, I would say.
Yeah, I honestly think I'll have to look, because I mentioned all of these. I don't think I mentioned the less than parentheses in my tutorials, but I kind of try to gloss over everything. And I have to admit that as you were describing like your stages of Linux enlightenment, I'd say, and I mean I even state this in the tutorials, that I'm still like a relatively junior penguin because I never had to really use Linux on a system administrator level, which is like stage 2. I just used it as kind of a software developer, and my primary focus was to write C++ code, but to kind of use Linux to move around files, copy them from my local computer to a server, etc. But in that process, I learned a lot of stuff. However, I never really kind of uh, gotten really deep because I never had the need to. And that's the reason why this podcast exists, so that people who want to learn more actually have the chance. So thank you for sharing all of your tips.
Oh, absolutely.
And I wanted to ask you. So I think we can conclude this from your previous sentences. But do you prefer Linux over other operating systems?
Actually, I prefer to use the best tool for the job. For example, if I were going to do financial management of some kind, I wouldn't use Linux. There's plenty of good tools on Macintosh. If I just wanted a little machine to carry around with me to get on the internet when I need to, I'd probably carry a Chromebook. So obviously Chrome operating system has Linux underpinnings to it, but it's not really a command line kind of system by default. But for day-to-day work, yes, I use Ubuntu as my Linux distribution. I'm not particularly tied to it, but I like the KDE graphical environment, so that's what I tend to use. So I use the Kubuntu distro, and it works great. I mean, almost any windowing system will do fine for me. So like I'm using the command line and the browser most of the time. So, but yeah, if I given the choice, I would pick Linux. Before I got into Linux, I was a Commodore Amiga, and that was a wonderful system. Just, multitasking personal computers. We had which had for the time just groundbreaking graphical capabilities and a really, really engaged and fun user community. So I used that for a long time. But when Commodore went out of business and so forth, I got into Linux, and I've never looked back since then.
Yeah, that's great. And I also wanted to ask you, um, do you think that people who use computers professionally, so for example, people who develop software but maybe never really had the need to switch from Windows to Linux, do you think that they should still learn how to use the basics of Linux or maybe even go into more advanced topics of Linux? Do you think that it helps you with other software development tasks in the sense that like it develops your sort of thinking, or do you think that not quite?
Um, that's a very interesting question. Um, I guess I'd start off by saying there are people have different kinds of mindsets around learning. Some people are more focused on, I don't know what you would call it. If you're in school, you're more focused on the grades than the learning. Some people are more on the grades, others are more about the learning. Um, Sometimes people call this mastery focus versus performance focus. So if you're performance focused, you want to do well. You want to get that bonus from your job. You want to get that high grade in your class. If you're more mastery focused, you learn for the sake of learning because it's fun. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I tend to be more mastery focused, and the people who I know are so I would say if you just want to learn something, if you are a Windows expert, um, if you just want to learn something that will expand your mind around what computers do and what's possible in day-to-day work, I would absolutely learn Linux. You will have a frustrating, difficult time at first making that shift. Because in Windows, a typical decision during the day is, what shall I click? In Linux, it's what do I need to invent in order to accomplish my task? And so Linux uses, I don't want to use jargon, but it's generative. You generate solutions as you use the system, as opposed to using the solutions that are provided to you by the system. It's kind of like the difference between um, paying somebody else to do the work for you. I like having a toolbox, and using different tools in combination. So that's really fun. If you're a Mac user, there's no excuse. You should learn it because it's right there already in your terminal application. Just pop open the terminal, pick up a copy of my other book, the Mac Terminal Pocket Guide, which is just like the Linux Pocket Guide, but it's Mac focused. And you can learn how to do all kinds of things on your Mac that used to be really time consuming, and now you can do in one command. So yeah, I think it's a really great opportunity to expand your mind around what computers can do.
Yeah, great. And I also wanted to ask you, I think this is actually the same question pretty much, but do you think that everyday users, so not only the people who engineer software professional or who deal with computers professionally, but like everyday people that are maybe using Windows and want to learn Linux, or maybe people that actually want to learn, would they be a good fit for a software engineering role? Do you think that maybe a good intermediate step would be for them to learn Linux?
Hmm. Um, Maybe. I think that for any average person, you can use Linux without ever touching the command line. So if you're comfortable with Windows or Mac and you would like to free yourself from commercial software altogether, you can install Linux and just use your familiar Firefox and Chrome browsers. You can use a suite of applications that's very much like Microsoft Office. In fact, extremely like them. So there will be very little learning curve. Yeah, just about anybody can use a Linux machine. I think the success of of Chromebooks is a testament to that as well, because that's basically there's Linux running there too. Um, but I would say for people who are in particular very technically inclined, who want to know whether they have the stomach for software development, I don't know if Linux will tell you that, but there's a certain kind of thinking that goes into software development where you are applying, you're memorizing a lot and applying that knowledge in creative ways. I mean, any programming language that you will learn has syntax that you have to memorize, and you need to use that language in creative ways to achieve a goal, just like you would use your spoken language to write a book or a paper or something like that. You have to use creatively, and you have to do that with programming. You have to do that with the Linux command line use as well. Yeah, so I would say maybe for somebody who is thinking about programming. I would say though that if you're going to be going into software engineering, the odds are reasonable that any employer you work for will have at least some Linux work going on there, if not exclusively Linux. So it's good for your background knowledge anyway.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that, and especially with the case you made that software engineering isn't that knowledge of Linux isn't necessarily a prerequisite for software engineering, because when I started programming, I was actually using Windows, and I used Windows for a long time before actually switching to Linux. So yeah, I agree with that a lot. And so I wanted to ask you about your Google education job. You said you work at Google at the education department, or that you do something related to education. So can you maybe give us more information?
Sure, I can give you some information about it. Mostly our work is internally focused, educating Google's own engineers. Um, but the some of the work that my team does, and I don't run the team. I have my own small team, but I'm part of a larger organization. Part of what we do is release free education for the world. I can give you two examples of that. One is material about machine learning. If you go to Google today and search for machine learning crash course, it's a 2-day long self-study machine learning class that's completely free. It's been translated into a bunch of different languages, and it's out there just so people can learn machine learning. That's it, just free service. And there's a number of educational initiatives like that. Another one that was just done recently is a course on technical writing as a career and as a skill. They're called Technical Writing 1 and Technical Writing 2. We released them about, I don't know, a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And they are online classes that will teach you how to write better. And which is a great skill, because if you're a software engineer, for example, you have to document what you do, you have to write comments, you have to write specifications. And so the tech writing courses from Google are a really, really great start. And again, completely free. Just go and take them. They weren't intended on being online learning, intended to be out there for universities and other teachers to take and use as classroom learning. But given the coronavirus situation, they are also being used quite a bit for self-study. Of course, was always meant as self-study, but the technical writing classes were meant as classroom. But they are doable as self-study.
Yeah, that is awesome. And I actually never went through the machine learning crash course, but I'm currently watching a course on Coursera, and maybe you know the person, Lawrence Moroney. Um, anyway, he's a guy from Google AI, I think, and he made a course on Coursera. And so I'm watching it just to get up to speed on TensorFlow. But yeah, I'll definitely
Mhm.
think I'll check out the crash course as well, because I actually took a machine learning course as a class, but I think I could refresh my memory. It was like, I think, a year and a half ago or something like that.
Mhm.
So anyway,
Mhm.
I think we came to the end. And do you wish to share anything before we end this podcast episode?
I would say first, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. This was a lot of fun. Um, I would say also to anyone out there who is just thinking about using Linux and isn't really sure, I would say give it a try. If you're interested, my book, Linux Pocket Guide from O'Reilly, the first 10 or 20 pages are a very rapid introduction to Linux. If you're technically inclined, you should be able to breeze through that pretty quickly. And then from there, it's all the commands you might want to use explained. And then there was the Mac version I mentioned as well, the Macintosh Terminal Pocket Guide, which does the same thing for the Mac Terminal. Um, O'Reilly has a lot of other good books for beginners. If you find the Linux Pocket Guide too short, then they have a lot of good ones as well. But yeah, thanks again. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you too. Okay, so this is it for this episode, and I will talk to you in the next one.